Very quickly, I just wanted to say many thanks for joining us today, especially to the speakers, our colleagues, Dr. Ghada Alatrash and Dr. Troy Patenaude. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Yoke-Sum, and I will be moderating the question period to follow. And then I'm going to say a few words about the topic today. I'm sorry, but I have to. And then hand the floor over to our speakers. The usual rules will apply. The mics should be muted until request to speak during the discussion period. Remember to use that ghostly hand thing. I will try and keep an eye on the chat. But I really invite you to please use the chat if you have any useful resources to share with us. So a little bit of an PSI here, sorry, PSR. So public, yes, PSA here, public service announcement. Today's panel is recorded. So this is because of requests from those who could not make it today. Now, we hope that this is the first of a series of talks relating to the theme of decolonization to be held in AUArts. We hope that this would inspire other topics. And if you have any ideas, please send me an email. I just want to say once more, I'm extremely grateful to the speakers here today for their time and their expertise. And I will admit, grateful thanks to the IKG for helping here, especially to Sarah Perry-Din, Cassandra Paul, and Ashley Scarlett, and also to the School of Critical and Creative Studies. So I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm going to begin with the words of the Métis scholar, Dr. Zoe Todd. What do I know about the places I live in and who I share territory with? What do I know about the more than human beings that I owe my life to here, right now, in this place? We turn towards each other and acknowledge that we can only survive as a collective if we radically embrace principles of reciprocity, care, kindness, and gentleness. I recognize that I am an immigrant settler who is complicit in benefiting from settler colonialism in Canada. As an immigrant settler, I believe we have to recognize our privileges and to work towards justice and accountability with and for Indigenous communities. And so we are gathered here today in Mohkinstsis, in the territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Pecan, the Kainai Nations, the Stoney Nakoda, the Chiniki, the Bearspaw and Wesley Nations, and the Tsuut'ina Nation. Southern Alberta is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I want to say a few words about the theme of decolonization and then hand over to the speakers, so please bear with me. Arjun Appadurai, the anthropologist, once asked back in the 90s, when did the post-colonial begin? And he answered his own question, when third world academics arrived in first world universities. Now, those days, and I'm sort of like, these are my graduate days, we read Fanon, Césaire, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and the subaltern scholars. Post-colonialism took off in the hallowed halls of Western universities. I had naively assumed then that we had arrived. And to paraphrase the title of a very well-known cultural studies text, I thought the empire had indeed struck back. And while we did huddle over the text in specific courses and in certain disciplinary areas, the post-colonial never quite penetrated further to confront institutional and systemic racism, and the Western-centric academic status quo endured. Post-colonialism appeared to have stayed embroiled in epistemic contestations, but it did highlight the lacunae of knowledge and the absence of the non-West in academia itself. Back then, I did not use the term decolonization, even though I was doing anti-colonial pedagogy. We never used the concept because decolonization was basically linked to a political nation-state project of disentangling from a colonial power or a dominant power, a process of independence movements, especially after World War II, as colonies decolonize. We never used it to confront the system of academic white supremacy. But while the presence of empire or the dominant power might have waned, the knowledge, the form, the hierarchies, the operation structures have endured in many institutions, and this includes the Imperial University and its systemic practices. And this is why decolonization as process, praxis is imperative. And it was early in 2015 that the Rhodes Must Fall movement took off in England, and it was initiated by Black students in Oxford who demanded the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes. At the same time, the hashtag "Why is my curriculum white?" trended, bringing focus to the monolithic whiteness of course offerings, but also university structures. For the Rhodes Must Fall movement, it is merely not enough to diversify curricula, but that, and I quote from their manifesto, decolonization operates at the political epistemic, the ideological heart of the university, with reformative implications for every facet of a university's operation. It involves the decentering of Eurocentric value systems and knowledge production, the overhaul of the hierarchy of European ideologies, and the reappraisal of whitewashed histories. We see today many movements, strategies, and work being done in Canadian higher education, and that is positive. And as this is particularly in Indigenous studies. But I'm not gonna lie, what is happening right now in Canada, right now across Canada, on the political, the social, economic landscape weighs extremely heavily on my mind. There is so much more to do, so much more. And so decolonization, as Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang remind us in their pivotal paper, decolonization is not a metaphor. It's a process which is profoundly unsettling. I hope today the talk, the discussions, is a contribution to that process. And so without further ado, I'll hand this over to the speakers. Ghada, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Thank you for that, Yoke-Sum. Good afternoon to all of you. As I begin today, I am also thinking of the Indigenous land and the Indigenous peoples who have so very generously hosted us here in our nation of Canada. Today also, as I think of the notion of decolonization, my thoughts are centered around the question of the ethics of knowledge, one that I believe is laden with discrepancies and contradictions, a question that ought to constitute a foundation on which we construct our classrooms and pedagogical practices. Embedded within this notion, or within this question, is the notion of morals and ethics, knowledge systems, or to be more precise, what has been interpreted as truth and knowledge. As I sat to think of morals and ethics, matters that have been grappled with since Aristotelian times, a number of questions came to mind. Do I speak today about the ethical tensions I have to navigate as a woman of color in a white settler colonial Canada, a racialized body in the spaces that position me outside of race, outside of the construct of Canadianness, with a hyphen that deems me forever an ethnic other, a Syrian hyphen Canadian? Or do I speak as a professor in a classroom about the ethics of navigating histories and curriculums contoured by a colonial pen? Or do I address as a researcher the research ethics of the process of collecting data when I am researching, as for an example, the most vulnerable of Syrian refugee subjects, collecting data that is excavated from their bruised memories, data that speak to what is now buried under the ashes of their destroyed homes and dead corpses? As an Arab, do I speak about the ethics of a knowledge production disseminated through violent and violating educational systems and or frenzied media channels, a knowledge that ultimately and most troublingly comes to dwell in the minds and hearts of our students? Today, as we grapple with this notion of decolonization, I wish to think about the ways in which knowledge, or what is deemed as knowledge, is read and inscribed, interpreted, distorted, and even silenced in our epistemologies, and as critically, knowledge deemed as truth and is epistemologized, canonized, legitimized, and how in turn this knowledge also constitutes the ethics on which we knowingly or unknowingly participate in the everydayness of our lived realities. As a researcher and as a pedagogue, I am concerned with the ethics of how knowledge is constituted, negated, or simply dismissed, and with what counts as knowledge. As importantly, I'm thinking about the ways in which we can disrupt, challenge, and resist these truth systems by offering alternate ways of understanding, alternate ways of knowing and reading the world. Particularly, I am concerned with the ethical and moral considerations and implications of these systems of knowledge and how they have been implicated on my own subjectivity and identity as an Arab in a Western terrain. As I grapple with this notion of decolonization, I will begin with my Arabness, with the question about the production and manufacturing, as per Chomsky, of Arab identity in the West in such unethical ways. It is too often the case that we as Arabs are packaged into dehumanized racist portraits that erase our long and rich history and presents us as herds of people in pressing need of humanizing and in an urgent need of being liberated by a Western savior. For, as in the words of Arab scholar Edward Said, it is not an overstatement to say that in the West, Arabs are seen as just one large group of screaming fanatics who are practically faceless. Today, as an Arab Canadian professor, researcher, and citizen, I find myself continuously and exhaustedly standing face to face against hegemonic regimes of representation in my brown, racialized, Arab gendered body and resisting and battling against these truth systems, truths that have come to define me as an Arab in the West, as well as constitute Western knowledge of the Arab subject in general, truths that I insist are anything but true. This also in turn leads to another question. What are the ways then in which we can contribute to the unlearning of the colonial ways of knowing and understanding our world? How do we put a face to those who are presented as faceless? How do we how do we humanize that which is dehumanized? Here, one answer that I have come to believe in as a powerful tool of decolonization is that of stories. For as Dorothy Allison says, stories are the one sure thing I know to touch the heart and change the world. Indigenous professor Thomas King writes, the truth about stories is that that's all we are. Indeed, a powerful thought, but for me, it is also one that becomes troubling and unsettling when contextualized within the endless homogenized fixed stories on Arabs told through an unethical colonial lens and made to advance military schemas and to manufacture the consent of the Western masses. Before I share with you a couple of stories today, I would like to first consider the production of knowledge and the question of ethics or lack thereof involved in this production on the Arab subject as an unregenerate savage with light intellectual ballast who is in a falling state and is in desperate need of supreme Western intellectual development. On this note, I am reminded of Iranian professor Hamid Dabashi, who asks a very important question, one that later turns into a book. Can non-Europeans think? He writes, what about other thinkers who operate outside this European philosophical pedigree, whether they practice their thinking in the European languages they have colonially inherited or else in their own mother tongues? In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, thinkers who have actually earned the dignity of a name and perhaps even the pedigree of a public intellectual, not too dissimilar to Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Michel Foucault. Why is it, Dabashi asks, why is it that if Mozart sneezes, it's music? And he says, I'm quite sure the great genius even sneezed melodiously. But the most sophisticated Indian music ragas are the subject of ethnomusicology. Why is European philosophy deemed philosophy, but African philosophy ethnophilosophy, the way Indian music is ethnomusic? Here a question comes to mind. Within this academic space that I stand, one that is full of scholars, thinkers, and artists whom I do certainly hold in the most high regard, I ask, how many of us know, teach, or draw from the works of Arab thinkers, for example, and artists? And as importantly, as artists within the space of Alberta University of the Arts. Arab artists like Fatih al-Mudarris, a Syrian painter and one of the leaders of the modern art movement in Syria, who studied at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Rome, where he was influenced by Surrealism. Or Arab Palestinian Lebanese Ilyas Ziadeh, poet, essayist, translator, feminist, and pioneer of Oriental feminism. Or Asim al-Basha, an international Syrian-Argentine sculptor who lives in Grenada. Or Nasir Shamma, an Iraqi musician, composer, and oud player. Or Nadine Lebaki, a Lebanese actress, director, and activist, and the first female Arab director to be nominated for an Oscar in the category of Best Foreign Films. Or Zakaria Tamer, a Syrian short story writer and one of the most importantly and widely read and translated short story writers in the Arab world. Or Mustafa Al-Aqad, a Syrian film producer and director, best known for directing The Message and Lions of the Desert. Or Youssef Shaheen, an Egyptian film director and winner of the Cannes 50th Anniversary Award for Life Achievement. Or Syrian opera singers Luban Al-Quntar, who won the prestigious title of the first Arab opera singer from Syria, and in 2000 she was awarded the 5th prize at the Queen Elizabeth Singing Competition in Brussels, Belgium. Or Syrian Adonis, the poet, an essayist and a translator, who led a modernist revolution in the second half of the 20th century, exerting a seismic influence on Arabic poetry comparable to T.S. Eliot in the Anglophone world. And there's a list that is endless here of Arab thinkers. I mentioned artists who are certainly also thinkers, but Arab thinkers like Abdullah al-Arawi, Moroccan, or Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, Syrian, and a philosopher as well, or Arab Moroccan Fatima Mernissi, feminist thinker and sociologist, or Arab Egyptian Nawal Saadawi, feminist writer, activist, thinker, and a physician. And the list continues. It is important to consider the question of what constitutes our knowledge in the West. How ethical is our Western educational system when considering that which is deemed knowledge and truth is only presented in part, negated, muted, silenced, or fabricated as to serve corrupt and unethical, dirty agendas of power and greed? How ethical and moral, or how unethical and immoral, is that these knowledges are what have become internalized as our common senses and collective consciousness, and that of our students, and what are the moral and ethical implications and consequences attached? How does this dominant narrative, imbued with partial knowledge and presented as whole and true, bring our students to be either apathetic or, even worse, unempathetic? As importantly, how do epistemological resistance come to disrupt, denormalize, reconstitute, recreate, and re-extinguish an empathetic understanding? How may we counter these ways of knowledges, and how may we open the space for the local voices with faces to do the speaking and become active participants in the production of knowledge? After all, it was the photo, although face down, of the drowned and suffocated 3-year-old Syrian Alan Kurdi swept to the Mediterranean shore that moved the world to question their ethics, at least for a few short-lived months. Indeed, stories and photos of faces, although at times of the dead, do seem to stir our humanity's conscience in ethical ways. So on stories, currently here at Alberta University of the Arts, I'm teaching a number of courses in the School of Critical and Creative Studies. And I approach some of my courses through a critical race theory framework in which I draw from the experiential knowledges and lived realities of marginalized voices, the experiential knowledges of the other and their stories. First, as we look at the other Arab subject as one example, we begin by grappling with questions such as, what pre-existing knowledge do we have and do we hold on the Arab Middle Eastern subject, and what are its limitations? And could a shift in our knowledge allow for new possibilities of knowing to emerge? Another question, how have colonial Orientalist epistemological impositions come to unethically shape our views on the Arab subject? And how do narratives and stories written by the peoples, come to create new possibilities of knowing and understanding? In a course I taught, here's one story. In a course I taught in the winter of 2021, and while unpacking Edward Said's Orientalism and debunking the misrepresentations of Trump's Islamophobic rhetoric and Hollywood's endless portrayals of Arabs as fanatic terrorists whose only goal is to kill Americans, one of my students in the class introduced himself on Zoom as a white man and referred to what he read on tweets and social media, indicating that, I quote, most crimes in Calgary are committed by Middle Eastern men. Now, do keep in mind that these Middle Eastern men are personal to me. They are my two sons, my brothers, my father, my best friends, and as a matter of fact, students in the same class. Needless to say, I was taken aback. I took a step back and took in a few breaths as I reminded myself of the fact that the minds of our students are fallen victim to colonial ideologies and knowledge systems and have come to be shaped through the controls, confines, limitations that dwell in these unethical educational and media systems. As a Syrian thinker once said, morality and ethics can only be engaged by a free mind, and for as long as we're enslaved to anything, be it an ideology or power, we are not free, nor can we be ethical in our ways of knowing, thinking, or acting. So within this context, my role as a professor becomes that of fighting racism with knowledge, by way of epistemological resistance, of reclaiming a knowledge that was stolen and kept away from our students, of decolonizing a colonial education and narratives that do not allow for particular local voices to speak, of unpacking that which has been theorized through colonial accounts of history, and of offering the marginalized voices free rein to tell their stories through historical accounts, novels, stories, poetry, song, dance, and all sorts of arts and creative expressions, with the ultimate goal of also freeing the space which was and is colonized and unfree, and with the understanding that freedom is attained through activating the critical inner conscience, the critical consciousness. I think with my students about the importance of understanding hegemonic racist systems of oppressions on which our nation is constructed, of the ways we can come to question and disrupt the systems so that we may also come to change them. So at the end of that one winter term, the same student mentioned earlier wrote the following, and I do have permission from the student to share his words. I'm going to share my screen here just so that you can follow with me. 1 second here. I'm looking for the window. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so I will read the words of my students. Again, I do have his permission. This is at the end of the term. He writes, there is a cure for racial prejudice and or what can be referred to as widespread bias discrimination. I would be honest if I said that I was not somewhat initially biased towards Arabian, Arab culture or ethnicity, and I take ownership that I did have negative opinions. It was attributed to how little I knew of the culture and its peoples, which we were further magnified by what news streams convey to the public eye and what social media is portraying about the generalized Arab culture. When I did question my assumptions, I realized that they were faulty and notwithstanding to truth and relevance. When the class began to expose this critical issue, it became apparent that there is a spreading falsehood around Arab culture and Arab people. Combine what little information I knew from an uneducated sense to that with what is being spread in Western society, it is easy to adopt a negative mindset. And there is the issue at heart. People knew little of something or not at all, and just assume what is being said by public platforms to be an established truth. With that being said, I view this cure as a two-step approach for the common citizen. Step one, acknowledge that there is bias within us and be willing to question our generalized assumptions. And step two, do the work, begin to learn more about the culture in question, disseminate what their culture is all about, that the respect and adoration component will manifest within itself. Arab people are cast unfair focus and what I believe to be inhumane attention. Yet when I got to know them more, I came away understanding that they are quite the opposite. Compassion, kindness, eagerness, and diligence would simply portray Arab people. And I press others to embrace similar stances, whereas knowledge articulated through a portrayal of love, kindness, and admiration will quickly eliminate the toxicity of racial prejudice. It starts with me advocating for such admirable and beautiful people. Now, keep in mind that this was over only, one term, this sort of a change. And to me, this is decolonization at work. On another note, as a Syrian, and might I add, as a privileged Syrian Canadian woman and citizen who continues to wake up to over a 10-year everyday grim reality in a war-torn homeland, where, as per the words of Antonio Guterres, head of the United Nations Human Commission of Refugees, Syria has become the great tragedy of this century, a disgraceful humanitarian calamity with suffering and displacement unparalleled in recent history. Here I cannot but speak about Syria today and about the most shameful and unethical stance of what has been an apathetic, offhand, and deaf humanity. In the classroom, as we talk about the Arab-Syrian subject within the context of an Arab Spring, whose desperate outcries have not been heard by a deafened humanity, and as we try to make sense of what it means to be Syrian today, and in an effort of sensitizing a knowledge that has been so very desensitized through Western media and news, I often resort to YouTube videos or films that capture a raw reality from within Syria, a reality in which children lay charred, bloodied, and dead, or suffocating and unable to breathe on camera because of sarin gas attacks ordered by a Syrian war criminal and tyrant Bashar al-Assad. Before I show the videos in class, I always preface the clips with a content warning, as is protocol. However, within this topic of decolonization, I recently asked my students their opinions on whether or not they wish to see these sorts of disturbing and gutting, but real and true images. Their response was unanimously that they do not want their knowledge washed out and demand their right to receiving a knowledge presented in its rawest form. I have since honored their wishes, and their wishes ought to also be heard within our conversation today on decolonization. Also on this note, I have one final story for you today about a student, and I also wish to share this story with you. As mentioned earlier, there is a limitation of the knowledge produced by Arabs, not only on Arabs, but also by Arabs, hence the importance of translation of Arabic texts into English. One of the poems I translated is titled, "If You Are Syrian These Days," for Syrian Fadi Azzam. It's an epic poem that takes about 20 minutes to recite, but I will only recite a few lines of what I translated with for my students, and I will read the first few lines in Arabic so as to disrupt a dominant colonial English narrative. And then I will read a few lines in English, and then I will tell you the story. إن كنت سوريا هذه الأيام فأنت تحمل الغطاء والكشف، اليقظة والمنام، الحلم والكابوس في زفرة واحدة، تتجلد بالهجير وتذوب من برودة العالم. If you are Syrian these days, you stand shielded and exposed. You are the awakening and the delusion, the dream and the nightmare, all in one breath. You are a breath that freezes in the sweltering heat and melts in the chill of this world. If you are Syrian these days, you are urged to attend etiquette schools where everyone is there to civilize you, to advise and guide you, to speak for you and silence you, to identify your class and where to classify you, to put you together and disperse you, to release and restrain you. Schools where they teach you lessons about how God creates heavens and things from carnage, how the victim should ask to be pardoned by the executioner, how a country is burnt in the name of the sun, and how to kiss the hand that kills, the shot that assassinates, and the missile that obliterates, and how flowers are accused of treason. After class, and after reciting these words, one of my students replied with an email, and I have asked her permission to also share her thoughts. And so here's her thoughts. She writes, "Dear Dr. Alatrash, Today's class touched my soul. I could not keep my camera on because of the tears that kept filling my eyes. The poem read in class, in the beginning of class, struck a sensitive part of me as it gave words to emotions I have been feeling regarding my indigenous ancestry, the connection, the human connection. These thoughts are more than welcome to be shared with the author. The dream and the nightmare all in one breath was one of the lines that first got my attention because it directly addresses the true reality of the world for so many. There are so many people who love to be alive, myself included, but we find ourselves caught in a world that works to wipe us out of existence. I am an Indigenous woman and I have lived in Lethbridge most of my life, where racism against Indigenous people is very prominent. Being part Tongan, Polynesian, I just relied heavily on that for approval from people and eradicated myself from my Indigenous relations. I never wanted to be known as an Indigenous person. I oppressed my own culture because the dominant white narrative told me I was less than for something as simple as my ancestry. I suppressed myself because of what Fadi Azam said in his poem, "You are encouraged to attend schools to civilize you." I attended schools where I was not written in history except for in terms of a savage. I attended schools that removed Indigenous history because the law worked to assimilate my history out of existence. I believe I wrote the words down correctly that said, "Even our hell is our heaven." And that brought up everything I feel. I feel so grateful to be in Canada, but I feel so much pain in being erased. I feel angry at, quote, "the makers of our nothingness," as per Fadi Azam. We're feeling gratitude for existing the way I do today. Just to bring it all together with the reading for this week, Jamaican Kincaid's chapter ended with, "Even if I really came from people who were living like monkeys in trees, it was better to be that than what happened to me, what I became after I met you." The readings combined with the poem are truly inspiring and helpful as I navigate to find my connections within myself and to allow myself to take up this space in a world that has told me I am not worthy to exist. So I took this piece and I sent it to the poet or to the author, Fadi Azam. And then as he received it, he said, "I would like to respond." And so I take his piece and I translate it and I send it to my student, Emily. And this is what Fadi Azam writes. And this was all in one course. He says, "I have a simple message for her if possible. Indeed, the makers of nothingness come in different languages and shape, but they are everywhere, deeming us inferior, seeing us less civilized than monkeys, animals, and plants. They will try to kill us in every way possible, financially or morally. They will try to take us out of history, visit us in novels when they please, and mute our voices. They have done this for hundreds of years to you, and they are doing the same to us today on the pretext of our terrorism as Arabs. We have no other way but to resist and broadcast our narrative as a middle finger. The explosions in our narratives are not induced with dynamics, but with with dynamites, but with beauty, strength, reason, and knowledge. We must resist feeling inferior. We must reject their standards of beauty and the ethical messages, quote unquote, for their greedy businessmen. We must contest their success models. We, women and men, East and West, must open up the borders amongst one another and dismantle the erected walls, for the unity of goodness and truth in our effort will indeed make their task more difficult and will help pave the way for a world that is less barbaric and unfair. As for you, Emily, I hope you will remain as beautiful as the spirit of your great ancestors, and rest assured that on the other side of the world, all the way in Syria, are those who join their voices with yours, who bow to your pain, and who stand with you and with anyone who suffers injustice. Do not stop being proud of the voices of your ancestors. Now, believe it or not, there was more messages and exchanges between Fadi and my student, but I will spare you that. But this is what decolonization looks like to me in a classroom. On the final note, Syrian poet Adonis writes, How bitter a language is now, and how helpless the alphabet. He tells us, I have always felt the need to reinterpret our history, for history is not made up only of facts, but of meanings which we need to reveal. Often our history is told by those in power. Poetry, for him, has the extraordinary ability to express the identity of a people. It does not reinvent history, but expresses its deepest meanings. And then he ends with, I prefer to be a prophet. Hannah Arendt says, I'd say the most important thing for me is to understand. As long as I manage to think something through, I'm satisfied. Paulo Freire speaks of this whole process of conscientization, of developing a critical consciousness through reflection and action, a process that allows us to know our reality in order to change it. It is this that I consider part of my ethical practice as I engage in a decolonizing framework of education, where decolonization becomes an epistemology for that which had been colonized, marginalized, othered, and after silenced. My ethical responsibility becomes that of helping mobilize a movement to free an epistemology from the fangs of colonialism, of partaking in the epistemic rewriting and retelling of histories, and in resisting, disrupting, and questioning institutionalized hegemonic productions of knowledge. It is only when this sort of freedom is attained and offered in the form of education to our students that we can hope for an empathetic understanding to emerge and for an ethical and moral humanity to be fostered. Hannah Arendt also reminds us of the importance of trust in mankind, a trust which is hard to formulate, but one that is fundamental, a trust in what is human in all people. Otherwise, the venture becomes impossible, she says. Here, I am thinking a trust in mankind can only be achieved through a trust in the system, its ethics and its morals. And a trust in the system can only be one inclusive of all voices, stories, histories, and accounts, which also means decolonizing, recentering, recontouring of epistemic terrains in our institution. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ghada. That was so powerful, and I look forward to our next talk. If Troy is ready, whenever they are ready.
Sure. Wow. Thanks, Hara. That was amazing. That the last letter that you read, just I had chills thinking it just I brought back memories of reading Rilke's letters to a young poet as I as you were going over that. It was just like, yeah, really powerful. Thanks for that. Oki Daranast Ada Ambawastich Townsi, everybody. My name is Troy Patenaude, and I was born in Nipissing Anishinaabe territory around the Upper Great Lakes in what's now called Northern Ontario, in lands covered over by what's referred to as the Robinson-Huron treaties now, a little bit of the Williams treaties as well over there. And my mom's side of the family is of settler colonial descent from mainly Scotland and England. And my dad's side of the family is from a community that is currently still referred to as the Georgian Bay Métis community. And this community is different, has differences from the Métis communities that we hear about here across the prairies. But there's also connections. And one of the interesting things about our time is I think we're starting to learn how to, embrace differences. But I just wanted to let you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. I grew up really not knowing much about my ancestors at all, next to none really. In the late 19th century, there was, ancestors from my the community on my dad's side of the family, the Georgian Bay Métis community, as certain fishing rights and hunting rights and land and the way they were treated came into play more and more. It became easier for people in for our ancestors to not share with their children where where they were from, who they were, and to hide, especially hide the fact that they had Indigenous blood. That was a really it was a way to help what was seen at the time, to protect the children, and keep them away from the oppressive behaviors and policies and things that were happening around the time. And so that's what happened to my family. So I didn't really grow up knowing anything about it. And then in my early or mid-teens, something around that time, one of my dad's aunts started to help uncover all of these connections and these identity pieces for our family. And so it's been so now, well, more than half my life here, I've been still on this journey, and I'm still learning about what this is. I mean, I feel like, here, especially growing up with white skin in this world, with white privilege, even while I have my ancestors from that Georgian Bay Métis community there, I grew up not really knowing about that part of me. And so it's like, even to this day, I still go through a mini identity crisis all the time. And current conversations around the definition of Métis identity and things like that as well too are all really, really important conversations. And it's so it's, I'm enmeshed in these things. All this to say, I'm still learning myself. So I feel really honored to have been invited here to speak today. I mean, in a lot of ways, I feel like there's I feel really honored to be invited. Although I was born in the Upper Great Lakes in Northern Ontario, I've actually lived most of my life here in Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Nakota, Métis lands here in what's now called Southern Alberta. And every summer, in between the age of 6 and 12 or so, my parents would either we would drive back together to Ontario, or sometimes they would just put me on a plane alone, and my uncle or my grandmother would meet me on the other end to spend my summers just out in the bush mainly with my cousins and one of my uncles and aunts, just so I wouldn't lose contact with that side of my family, even though we were living here. So I spent a lot of time, even while living here, going back home, staying connected with my cousins and family as best I could. And I feel like I grew up doing a lot of wood hauling for my uncle around there too. I was I definitely helped with a lot of labor around the camp and the house. So but that's all good. It was it's part of my life. And so when I around my late teens or early 20s, I ended up becoming a participant in an organization's programs called Ghost River Rediscovery. And it no longer exists. It ended a few years ago, but it was an organization that was mainly dedicated towards reconnecting Indigenous youth with Indigenous elders out on the land in traditional ways and in land-based learning kinds of ways. And I eventually became a guide for this organization and started working with youth myself. And so most of my 20s was involved working throughout around Calgary, prairies, foothills, lots in the Rocky Mountains, and even as far west as Vancouver Island for a while, working in this way with Indigenous youth and elders and community leaders to out on the land. And while I was doing that work, I started to realize that wow, it doesn't take you long, as the youth are sharing around the sharing circles or working through things while we're out on a hike or harvesting something in the bush. it doesn't take long to see that the idea and to learn that the idea we get passed down to us about what Canada is, how it works, how, you know, what our history is as a nation, and what's celebrated, um, and then in turn, as a reflection of those things, how our institutions should work to work best and to, you know, to work in the most efficient ways, you know, what those ways are. um, that all of those things that got passed down to us is a completely like different reality from what I was hearing working with these youth and these elders. Um, and it started to bother me, and I became really frustrated that that there was yeah, a part to Canada that we weren't being taught, that was being concealed, and it's being concealed by design. It's by design of, you know, the Canadian government, the Canadian nation state, and the all of the systems involved in its existence, including the education system, the art world, same thing. That all of those things are there, you know, to make me forget who my ancestors were, or to make my ancestors, you know, feel that they couldn't share about who they were with their children and grandchildren and so on and so forth. You know, it's by design that I don't know any of those things. And so that brings me to this word decolonization, which we're here talking about here. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to add a few things to the conversation in the hopes that maybe we can have a question and discussion session here for, you know, 20, 30 minutes at the end at least. But that's really what it, you know, what it comes down to for me is that it really is all about the land. And in order to really understand decolonization, you have to first really, you know, understand what you're moving away from, that colonization piece. So decolonization isn't just moving away from, you know, from, you know, any old kind of struggle, as important as all struggles are, but specifically a settler colonial one, instigating the real life struggle for Indigenous life and land that's still going on around us here today, um, in different ways than it did in the 19th century, but it still is here. Um, and so, you know, I'm sure we all here have an idea of what that colonialism is, but just so we're all on the same page, you know, you could say it's something like a policy or a practice of partial or full control, political control or control over land and a people in order to politically control this land and, you know, build a new kind of sovereignty on it and extract from it to create wealth from that other people's land. Um, so, you know, that's in a real rough nutshell. But and then in settler colonialism, rather than where you have colonial people moving into a place and then sending that wealth back to like a home country, and, you know, always kind of, yeah, feeding back into the home country and having that home country be where your allegiance still lies. Settler colonialism is now about where things now are about staying in those, you know, the other people's lands and staying in them and erasing their presence, you know, devaluing the ways of knowing and being that have been existent in those places for thousands and thousands of years, in order to build a new kind of sovereignty, a new kind of sovereignty over that place. And so the moving away from that, the decolonizing from that, is so unsettling because it's like it's a complete revisioning of what our entire society should look like, how our institutions are, you know, are governed and run, and our complete understanding of how these systems and, you know, whether it's cultural, linguistic, political, educational, artistic, you know, how relationships to the land within all of those things are structured and enacted and understood and practiced. So, you know, in those ways, there, you know, you'll often see if you dig down deep enough that in all of these systems and institutions, what's usually happening is there's a Euro-Canadian or, you know, a European, a privileging of a European or white way of knowing or way of understanding in order, you know, and an oppression, a dispossession of Indigenous ones. And so the moving away from that is, you know, what I think of when I think of decolonization. But it's about the land. You can't forget about the land. And I think it's important to remember the land in this. You know, we, like at the beginning of this meeting, for example, we started with that land acknowledgement. And it's important that we really think about what those land acknowledgements are really saying, like where we really are, right? And that it's not just about the land in a sense um, of, you know, people lived here as though it's some sort of like backdrop for human activity or something like that, or that the land is like now some sort of like public commons that everybody just kind of has, right? These are all ways to erase Indigenous presence from this place. And so I remember when I became really interested about finding out more about the Indigenous lands that Calgary was on a few years back. This was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. I went out and visited with my friends out at SCCS. And we were sitting in a lodge, and we were, there was myself, a few other people that I brought with me from Calgary out there. And then we were sitting there with people like Kent, a young man, Vivian, a young man, Chris McHugh, and they were sharing with us, and others, they were sharing with us, you know, their answer to this question about, you know, where, you know, how, you know, what Calgary really is, or where we really are. And it took hours and hours and hours. And in fact, they had to like cut off their answers and stories all the time because they couldn't all fit it into an afternoon. And we were only there for an afternoon. But the story started, you know, so here we are asking about this place around Calgary, you know, the land around Calgary and Calgary. And they started with the sun. And, you know, you know, I'm not going to, you know, I don't know, it's not in my place to tell all the stories, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the things that came up in answer to that question about where we really are. But it started with the sun and the moon and the snakes. And like even this is before humans, like humans weren't even in the picture yet. And so they started talking about the sun and the moon and snakes. And then they talked about, a being, a person, a being called Napi, and how Napi helped with a whole bunch of creation of everything that we see around here right now, from the rivers we see here to the way the mountains are, the you know, certain animals, the way animals look, the way animals act on the land, the way certain plants are, the way certain plants do certain things or have certain characteristics about them that others don't, how Napi helped bring all of these sorts of things into existence in different ways. And then they started talking about, you know, the place where the nighthawks came down. There's a place where the nighthawks came down and saved Napi from a huge rolling boulder that was chasing him down on the prairies. And then they talked about a place where the Blackfoot people, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, were given the beaver bundle. and why that was significant, why that was important, and how that brought spirituality to the Blackfoot people here thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. That spirituality still exists today. And then they talked lots about different places where they were known for, this was a good place to get berries. And this place over here was a good place that they knew of for hunting elk. And then they talked about another old person, again, thousands and thousands of years ago, that helped save the Blackfoot people by ripping open the belly of a giant bird at a certain place here. And then they started talking about a place where a man named Cutswood had a dream, and how that helped bring to the Blackfoot people the teepee, what we now think of as a teepee, the lodge. And then they started also talking about other people and other events all throughout history. Another man named Scarface, and how Scarface also helped develop senses and bring senses and different nuances to spirituality here in this land thousands and thousands of years ago. And then even they talked about a place where Napi was just about to get married and found a wife, and how that all came about. And it's a really, really funny story, really funny story. But all of this went on, and these places we came to know are places that are still here and a part of Blackfoot awareness right now, like that place where that man a long time ago ripped open the belly of that giant bird, the entrails, the intestines of that giant bird spilled out onto the ground. And so that's now called the Belly Buttes near the Belly River. That's still here, and that's, the Belly River's still here. That place where the Nighthawks came down and saved Napi from that giant rolling rock. The word in Blackfoot for rock is Okotok, and that's still here, Okotoks. And you could still go to this day and you could see that giant rock outside of Okotoks, that rock. And then you can even see now that the place is still remembered where the elk were hunted lots. The word in Blackfoot for elk is Ponoka, and you can still go to Ponoka today and visit that, a few hours north of here, and see that place. And so here we are asking this question about where we really are, and trying to understand Calgary and what we're really nested, like whose land, and what that means when we say these land acknowledgements, right? Another time I was talking with Leonard Bastine and Eldon Yellowhorn from the Apatoxipikani Nation, and same thing. This was for my day job at Fort Calgary. And we were trying to see if there were any stories that Blackfoot had that were actually connected to that specific site itself, where Fort Calgary is today. And of course, there's lots, but the stories that they shared with us, we were asking about site-specific stories of this, the 40 little acre section at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers, where you can go and see a museum today. We were asking about that. But they started talking about the human body. The words for these places in Blackfoot are often connected to the body, right? So the word Mohkinstsis, that's where Fort Calgary is today, at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers. Well, that word is elbow, Mohkinstsis. Just like in Tsuut'ina, Nakota languages, same thing. It means elbow, whether Kutsistsi or Wechispa. And then it goes further. How Mohkinstsis is connected through different stories to the Nose, and we see Nose Hill on the land, and Nose Creek coming down from Nose Hill, and how the body is right there on the land. And then you go out further, and you see in Blackfoot, it's called the Hand Hills. The Hand Hills we have now just a little bit north of Drumheller. Those are the Hand Hills. And you go out the other way and you have this mountain out just kind of in between Calgary and Standoff, you know, kind of down south in the Rocky Mountains. There's a mountain called Heart Mountain. You know, so the land is like full of these stories, but like it's like the body, it's like Blackfoot bodies and real relationships and people and ancestors connected to the land. But now these places, they're all covered over with a different kind of knowledge. And this is by design. And we still get taught that, well, you know, this elk hunting grounds, this is Ponoka, and we think of that now as a little city or little town, right? Ponoka is a town. We don't really remember and know that it's actually elk hunting grounds. You know, we don't really know anymore or learn that that place where that man and where the Blackfoot got that beaver bundle thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago is now called Waterton National Park. And we think of that as a national park. And we think of where that place is, that Prince of Wales Hotel on the village site of Waterton. That's what we think of now when we think of that place. But thousands and thousands of years ago, that's where spirituality came into this land, into this place. We don't remember that, or we're not taught that. Well, not non-Blackfoot people or non-Indigenous people perhaps are not taught that, you know, in our schools and our institutions. And I can go on and on and on about this, but you can see where I'm going with this. You know, Mohkinstsis as well, of course. Now, you know, we think of it as Calgary, you know, and that place at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow. When we say Calgary, that's what we think of, but we don't really know anything about that story, you know, about Mohkinstsis and the elbow and its connection to the body, real life. And so decolonization, you know, is really, you know, I'd say it's a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, artistic divesting of colonial power over a place or land. You know, so it's a divesting of colonial power over land, but also in all of the relationships that all of the systems that have been set up to be like a new kind of sovereign system, erasing the indigenous ones that have been here for thousands and thousands of years. Yeah, setting it up so those are, you know, are erased, are devalued, oppressed. So I lost my train of thought there, but I think my point was mentioned. But that's what I think about when I think of decolonization, that divesting of colonial power over land, especially, and in the way we relate to land and how it's like understood, our relationship to land. So, you know, in the art world, it comes up big time when we see, you know, like in a lot of ways, you know, certainly at a time in history, Canada was really, really known for it, you know, its artists working out on the land. And you know, the art world in Canada is, you know, is set up on this, you know, on this land in these colonial ways. So there's a lot there for us to unpack, and to look at that relationship. What's that about? But yeah, you know, I can go on and on and on with these things, but I also wanted to make sure that there was time for questions. So maybe I'll stop there, everybody, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Troy. That was so rich, and I'm just so grateful that the two talks connected so much in the strength of storytelling as a method, and a narrative tool for decolonization. I will now open up the floor to discussion, to questions, to comments. Anyone out there? Please use the hand. I know we are all thinking. I've got two. Okay, I think Andrew was the first one to go. Andrew, then Chris.
There were just a couple things that I think about. They're not really quite questions, in part because I don't feel like our presenters need to be responsible for answering all questions related to decolonization. But two things that I think about quite a bit, because I do feel very privileged, and Ghada talked a lot about the role of being a teacher and the privilege that we get to influence and make choices about what's presented to our students in terms of content. So I really, I mean, I'm so grateful for that privilege. You know, my sadness is being sessional and never knowing when I'm going to have that privilege. But it's an incredibly meaningful thing to have in your lives. And one of the things I find is a challenge, or something that I try to figure out how to both provide students with, or do my best to provide a diversity of knowledge or present a diversity of knowledge, but then also trying to help them figure out how to cope with the lack of power we have on an individual basis. Because I think a lot of times it's like, okay, I'm helping with and supporting exposure to different kinds of knowledge, but there's such a sense of frustration and burden and powerlessness that can come with that. And I'm thinking, for example, of an essay on monstrosity that we read in my 300 ceramics class, that talks about some of the dynamics of minoritization as a general experience, mostly through a lens of female minoritization and the construction of the monstrous for female artists. And you know, one of the things that's good about this article is that it includes the very real dangers to physical and mental health that are part of being in a minoritized group. And at the same time, I talk about, or try to emphasize, some of the sort of strengths or privileges or positive aspects that come out of that experience as well. And, you know, but my students at the end of this conversation will like, well, is it worth it? I don't see how it's worth it. Like, yeah, there's these positive aspects to that experience, most fundamentally that knowing who you are, that's so critical to self-identity and self-actualization. But is that worth all of this potential penalty that I have to cope with? And, you know, my answer is kind of like, well, we don't get to choose. We are stuck with that situation. So no, I can't necessarily say it's worth it, but we don't get to choose. And so it's good to recognize all the positive things that we get out of our minoritized aspects of our identities. So it's just sort of one example, but around this general question about also trying to figure out in that process of communicating. And it's so beautiful watching students become more self-aware, more self-actualized, hopefully more supported in who they are. And yet, you know, I'm always trying to figure, and how can I do that without it just becoming this huge burden? So that was kind of one thought that I just think is related to what we're talking about, and I'm definitely interested in hearing people's ideas around providing the information as a source, or framing it as a source of strength in their personal development. Yeah, so that's my thought that I'm sharing.
Thank you so much. I just wonder if, I either Ghada or Troy would like to respond, or in fact anyone. There is another hand up, and there's also a question in the chat that I might as well mention as well, which is wondering if you can touch on how to avoid tokenism, how to decolonize content without re-traumatizing students or staff. Chris, I see your hand and I'll be coming there. Just basically giving an opportunity to anyone to respond, particularly our speakers.
I'll just perhaps comment on what Andrew said and give maybe the other speaker the chance to comment on the other question. But Andrew, I just wanted to touch on the point that you had expressed about students feeling a lack of agency on that individual level. And we certainly do discuss this. I'm teaching a course right now on prison literature, where we're talking about the worst of human lived conditions and experiences within the cells of the prisons in Syria that have been labeled by Amnesty International as human slaughterhouses. So imagine that helplessness that not only I feel as a Syrian, a privileged Syrian living here in Canada, but also for these students who are taking in some very heavy content and not knowing really what to do with that. So that conversation certainly does come to surface often. And what and I'm obviously also trying, as you are, as we all are. So I don't, like you said, I don't really have the questions all at hand for certain, but the way that I go about it, sorry, I don't have the answers all at hand, but the way I go about it is, first of all, I do have hope, I do have faith. Palestinian Mahmoud Darwish says, I have hope. It comes and goes, but I will never bid it farewell. And where my hope dwells is in the minds, in the presence of these students. This is a generation that I think can I encourage them, run for political offices, be part of the systems, be part of those spaces in which you can make change. So the hope is that these conversations will become materials in their hands where they can actually make change. And I'm not really romanticizing. I do believe in the power of the individual. As an Arab today, if we go back to 2010, December of 2010, Mohammed al-Bouazizi, who was a Tunisian Arab man, as an individual, when he burned himself in public, he began a revolution that continues to burn today, that was sparked all over Arab countries, in which dictators were forced to resign. So I am one who certainly believes in the power of the individual, and we just have to have faith. If a Syrian prisoner says that they have hope, then I certainly will continue to hold on to that hope. So I hope that answers your question in ways that I'm also trying to figure it all out.
Troy?
Yeah, can you repeat that other question?
The other question came from the chat. Wondering if you can touch on how to avoid tokenism, also how to colonize content without re-traumatizing students or staff.
Yeah,
Difficult.
well, the avoiding of tokenism, I find it's I think one of the ways that it's possible to do an all right job at that is through this through reciprocity, and really, I mean, you might call it compensating, or giving an offering that is like really valuable, that really honors the person's knowledge who's there or you're inviting in, and that's a short answer, perhaps, one way about it. But also, I think there's often a deeper more systematic, deeper thing within institutions and organizations that can contribute to tokenism, because I sometimes I see it happening, or a trend where it's tending in that direction, where people are trying to kind of skip ahead. Let's say, there's that, we see the words truth and reconciliation, and often there's people trying to skip ahead to the reconciliation part or the relationship building part without really taking care of the truth, the ownership piece first, the the deeper, more understanding of like decolonizing, as a materiality, as a practice, first. Without that, actions can often be tokenistic, or at least I see the trend that's a common thing to happen. Without that deeper internal work within a person or an institution first, usually actions will be more tokenistic, or they're more likely to be tokenistic, I would say. And then, the decolonizing content without re-traumatizing students. Well, there's a couple of things I've done. I, say before presenting content that could be re-traumatizing, I'll mention to people up front, this is what we're going to be talking about today, something like this, but if this is going to be, re-traumatizing and you have to leave, definitely take care of yourself, and I'll give people the opportunity to leave, and not be there at all. And we can like talk about it in another way later on down the road. Or there's something you could do to the just like well, I guess it depends on the type of content that you want shared, but sometimes I find, and this happens to me as an instructor sometimes as well, I'm wanting to kind of like, explain things and kind of get the whole history of things kind of out, and these are these facts and these are these facts, and kind of, here are the facts, you're kind of presenting these elements kind of like that, instead of just living it ourselves. And sometimes if we're coming from a place already that, no, we're in Blackfoot lands, this isn't a public commons. The land here is not a public commons. This is Blackfoot lands or Tsuut'ina lands or Nakota lands, wherever we are. And we're just coming from that place. As soon as we come from that place already, our language kind of changes. Our approach to things kind of changes. What becomes valued and important is different suddenly if we're already coming from a place like that is already, centering indigeneity and allowing it to change us. Yeah. So anyway, just some thoughts there.
Thank you so much. I have two more questions. I noticed that we've got 7 minutes. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris for question, and then to Brittany. I just want to say that the conversation can continue after, right, when it ends.
I'll be really quick. I threw my hand up because the silence was deafening, and I didn't want that to be the conclusion to what's been a brilliant afternoon. I have to teach it too. So then all I'm going to do is say thank you very much. I wanted you to know that you were heard. I personalized that. I heard you. I know the room heard you. And now I'm hearing other people recognizing they heard you with their good questions. And we get reciprocity going. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And my summary statement would be my takeaway, and I'll start class in 6 minutes with a decolonize. I heard about repersonalizing the land from Troy. And then I used his word repersonalize to rethink what I heard you Ghada say, repersonalize the body. So decolonization and repersonalizing, getting the person back into the sites that have been made static and dead by colonizing narratives. And I'm going to work on memoirs here with the students this afternoon. Memoirs is a genre, a form that is about repersonalizing and reclaiming and going back to home to start. And then just to finish, because Billy Ray Belcourt, A History of My Brief Body, or A Mystery of My of his brief body. We could play around with, but we won't. But his epigraph, I just will, failure to hear will matter to those who do not listen, the colonizers, and those who are not heard, the colonized, working out on that and finding space between, will matter to those who are not heard, not only because stories without an audience do not survive, and that's why I was panicking with the silence in the room and wanted to decolonize by at least saying thank you. So thank you. And then also because being heard or ignored impacts how the past resonates in the present. And so then I want to say to both of you, our community has heard you. You're a part of this community, but your stories, just to work this out, you resonate in the present. We have a school, we have it here and now, and your body's my body, everyone, but we're here, and I really got to go. Bye.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm going to go to Brittany, and then I'm going to ask you all to look at the chat questions for some questions, some comments there, and so many goodbyes, grateful goodbyes. Brittany, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a question, more as like an expression, as being one of Ghada's students last semester, and being able to really have my eyes opened to some of the things that as a white person I was very, very ignorant to prior to the class, and partaking in a discussion like this, given everything that we are experiencing in the world right now. I more or less just wanted to extend a huge thank you to both the speakers, and to you, Yoke-Sum, for facilitating it, because I think it's so important for a space to be created for those others, the other voices, to be heard and to be spoken. Because I think for me, I really still struggle with this idea of wanting to create that space, but also wanting to be that person to facilitate when it's not necessarily my place, right? So it's like, I love being able to be a part of a space where I can learn through other voices how to be able to share these stories and be a safe space for those voices and for those people. And so I guess, yeah, I'm so grateful to have been witness to this, and to listen and to hear the stories, and even just learn things that I didn't even know. So I'm always learning, and I'm so grateful for these things. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brittany. There is a question. It's from Kathleen. I know that she's still here. We might not be able to answer all her questions. She has a lot of it. Let me just read this out. When we look back on these past 2 years and how conversations have been shared by partners of AUArts, may I ask the panelists if they might share insights about practices that are either evidence or might have amplified the impression, at least, that decisions have been presented in keeping with a Western capitalist, patriarchal, colonial system. In other words, how are we as an institution doing with decolonization? The instructors seems to be taking this on. How is the institution doing? It feels that a colonial voice is coming to the fore. Kathleen, I'm not quite sure if we can all tackle that today, but we've got 2 minutes, so I wonder if Ghada or Troy would really want to take this on. And again, very quickly before the 2 minutes are up, so I'm gonna quit. Sorry, I'll see if Ghada and Troy wants to take this on. Too much.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to jump. Well, I'll just say a real quick, simple answer, and maybe in the last minute, Ghada will have time as well. But really, I think, I'd say that absolutely, I see, work being done, and people, it's good to say that discussions like this are being had. And yeah, work is being done, but I also can't lie to you. I do think that there's a lot more that can be done, and I just to you know, maybe even bring it a little bit further. I might even say that you know, based on kind of what I see other organizations out there doing and that kind of thing, I might even say we might be a little bit behind the times. But absolutely, I also want to make sure that I recognize the work that is being done, because you know, there's lots of people working behind the scenes hard on these conversations and issues in different ways. So you know, absolutely, there's things being done, and that's all good. You know, we got to, you know, yeah, recognize that too.
Last word to Ghada, if she wants to take it on.
So I haven't been here long enough in this institution specifically. This is my second term around, but I certainly have seen, I mean, just having this conversation, Yoke-Sum, thank you for arranging it. And this conversation itself speaks to how we are decolonizing the system. So, I mean, this is decolonization at work, you know, in its most active present moment right now. So I do appreciate this, and certainly in the meetings that we're holding, there's always talks about inviting elders and hiring. You know, there's a very explicit call to hiring Indigenous faculties, and these are the ways I think that we can make certain that these issues are not only just being talked about, but are acted out. And you know, and I will end on this note. And as a country that claims to be a democratic country, and with you know, all of the principles on which we hope to continue to stand of social justice, I certainly do hope that these conversations continue just for the sake of our democracy and as an ethical responsibility. We are in these privileged positions, and we have to continue to act ethically. Otherwise, you know, simply letting things happen in front of our eyes and being so mute and silent is the most ethical and immoral. And I certainly appreciate these sort of efforts to take that on. So thank you. And I'm really honored. Troy, I loved the stories that you shared. That was very beautiful and informative. And thank you everyone for all the comments.
Thank you so much. As usual, like I said in the beginning, I hope this is the first of a series of talks. So do watch out for your inboxes for further talks like these. And if you have any ideas, please send me an email. You can find me easily, Yoke-Sum.Wong@AUArts.ca. All right, thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your questions. Thank you so much again for such a rich afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.